this may not be very woke of me, but I don't think gender is as big a barrier, since we all tend to spend, no matter what our personal inclinations, a lot of time with people of the opposite sex. I've always been reluctant about the trap of writing a series of books about the same character. As I always say to people, if you can arrange to become a best-selling novelist, I really recommend it to you. It's great. It's a great life.
Welcome back to Bestsellers. I'm Phil Williams.
And I'm Natalie Jameson.
And we've been gone for a while, but we're back.
We are. It feels weird but good. Like, I think we were gone for a bit too long, but life happens, work happens.
I looked on the platform we use to upload these, and I think it's a year,
Yeah. Wow. It's been quite a year again, right?
So is this yeah, exactly. That's probably why it's taken us so long to get our season together. Is this season 3? Is that what we're saying?
Do we just make it up? I think season 3, season 4. Like, yeah, it's a new one. Woohoo!
Yeah. It's the one with the difficult narrative arc. So what we're going to do is we're going to give you a couple of episodes before Christmas.
Correct.
And then several more after Christmas.
Indeed. And so let's just do a brief, aside from it being a bit of a year, you obviously don't have to go into your entire year, but how are you at this point? Are you reading? Are you writing? Is all good?
That's a really good question. I am in a reading glut, which has just been fixed by one of our bestsellers guests.
Yay!
That we're going to record later this week. But yeah, I've got some amazing books by the side of the bed, and I've just not been, my eyes have been really tired.
Mm-hmm.
So it's been a physical thing rather than an emotional thing. It's been like, I can't stare at text, so I just want to stare at some nonsense on the phone. And I've not really had the mental capacity to watch new stuff either. So it's not just like a reading thing. When it comes to watching stuff, I've been very much going back to comfort movies rather than, oh yeah, Slow Horses has just dropped on Apple. Let's see what season 2,
Yeah. I know what you mean.
Lack of brain space.
Yes. I kind of had a spurt of reading loads. I kind of raced through lots of Sarah Manning's books in the last few months, who I really love as an author. And then, had a massive drop off too, where I was like, I can't. It was less like that my eyes were tired. It was more that I couldn't focus on a new story. I just couldn't take in anything. It didn't even have to be that complex. It was just like, I'm not into it. I could literally kind of feel myself start a new book and then just slip away after the first few chapters.
Which is bad, isn't it? Because then I feel like you're not being fair to the book.
Yeah, I know. And how much hard work goes into them. And it's not that they're bad books at all. It's just my attention is scatty.
And let's just be clear, you and I love reading. Mm-hmm. That's why we do this podcast. So but I tell you what helped me to relax is having done last season with you. A number of writers said to us that they'd had this in the pandemic, didn't they? Yeah. So I think, well, and writers are the most prolific readers I know. Mm-hmm. So if they're struggling, I kind of just give myself a break and I think, I'll get back into it.
Yeah, for sure. And also I think, I don't have to tell you or anybody listening, there are so many books out there. So there's so much choice. And sometimes it's a bit of that paralysis of choice. You're like, well, I don't know what to go for actually. So I've got loads stacked up on my Kindle to read, but some really old books too that I've never got round to reading. Like I Capture the Castle, which I've never read before. So that's on my reading list too.
Well, I'll tell you what I'll do then, since you've mentioned that, is let's get into episode 1.
Correct.
Because he's a blockbuster guest I've wanted for years. And then off the back end, I'll see if I can get on my hands and knees while you're listening to episode 1. Have a look on the bedroom floor and I'll give you some of the books that are then piled up ready to go.
Okay, settle back. Whatever you're doing, if you're walking, if you're commuting, if you're cleaning, whatever it is, really hope you enjoy this first episode back where we get to chat to Scott Turow.
I am hugely excited to tell you that our guest on Bestsellers today is somebody I've wanted on this podcast for a good couple of years. He's the author of 13 books. The 13th is the book we're going to talk to Scott Turow about now, Suspect. And so excited that you're on Bestsellers, Scott. It's a real honor to have you on. I've been a fan of your work for a long time, and it's great to get to meet you and great to chat to you about it. Thanks for doing it.
Well, I'm honored to be here. So it's very elite company.
Take us back to the origin of Pinky, first of all, because I read The Last Trial, I think at the beginning of lockdown. I think we're probably going back 2 years for that. And yes. her grandfather, one of your greatest creations, is in that. And now in Suspect, she's breaking out and she is the central character. So how did you get to Suspect from The Last Trial?
Well, in The Last Trial, originally, Pinky was kind of a foil for her grandfather, Sandy Stern, who's supposed to be a lawyer's lawyer, as they say. And she's everything that he is not. So he is courtly and she is brash. He is always well prepared and she's completely impulsive. He is totally reliable and she isn't. And it was kind of a joke in the opening scene when Stern looks over and sees that his granddaughter, who's, as I say, notoriously unreliable, is actually there for the first day of trial, where she's playing the role of the paralegal. But she was one of those characters who kind of demanded that her role be expanded, which is always, frankly, good news to a novelist when a character demands, more time and space.
So I'm really glad you said that, because as a reader, when I read The Last Trial, I'm thinking, I really like this Pinky character. And she's like a scene stealer for me as a reader. So yes. I thought there's more to go with her. Was that your feeling as the creator as well? Did she kind of demand that you put her in her own novel, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, I mean, there's always, if things are going well, a character who runs away with the book, who didn't have nearly as large a role as it turns out. And it's only because for whatever reason, she clamors from the unconscious, for more time and space, as I've said. So by the time I finished, it occurred to me that this young woman easily could support a book of her own if I were the author to be able to write it. So, and there were obviously certain challenges. The most daunting to me was that the character's 40 years younger than I am. So, but I figured, why not? Norma Mailer, in a remark I've always borne in mind, says the worst thing about being a novelist is that you can make a critical mistake and not be aware of it for 6 months. You're off on a project and it becomes unworkable. And then you say to yourself, why was I idiot enough to do this? So, and certainly the idea of writing in Pinky's voice was not something that I even entertained to start with.
I think it's interesting that you were saying, so do you think that the fact that she was or is so much younger than you currently are was more daunting than writing in a female voice?
Well, I mean, this may not be very woke of me, but I don't think gender is as big a barrier, since we all tend to spend, no matter what our personal inclinations, a lot of time with people of the opposite sex. Mm-hmm. But obviously my social milieu does not include a lot of 33-year-olds, leaving aside, my children and stepchildren. So, so my exposure is limited, and thus the imaginative possibilities seem limited.
Can I just ask as well, I like what you were saying about how, that character of Pinky kind of developed herself really as a side project whilst you were writing an earlier book. But I love how the creative brain works. And do you think it's fair to say that if you'd sat down and really tried to focus on the next character I want to write is going to be, it would never be Pinky, because it's only when your brain is focused on something else that it allows another part of it to go off and wander and develop something totally unexpected.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very true. And I certainly, that's not what I would have conceived of. It never dawned on me, but a British journalist pointed out to me that I've never before written an entire novel in which the point of view never enters that of a licensed attorney. So consistent with what you're saying, Natalie, I doubt I would have I would have wandered that far from my natural terrain to somebody who's not a lawyer. And, Pinky is not. She certainly understands a good deal about the law, having dwelled in criminal courtrooms for quite some time. But she's not an attorney and, doesn't like to think that she embraces their way of thinking or being.
Yeah.
Once you dealt with the initial daunting aspect of dealing with a first person female character, 30 years younger, 40 years younger, whatever you say, once you've dealt with that, what were the liberating aspects for you? Because what I think, and this is another question on the list, but I think this has got the potential to become a brand new hot series if you want it to.
Yeah, people keep suggesting that to me. First among them, David Kelley, who's optioned the rights to the novel. So he would be all too happy if I wrote 6 more Pinky novels, because that's what David wants to do with Pinky, is turn her into, the lead character in a recurring limited series. But
you sound less friendly.
I've always been reluctant about the trap of writing a series of books about the same character, because and I regard it as a trap because it really seems like you're pinning your own wings. There's so much of the kind of imaginative, creative exercise that Natalie was talking about in first coming to terms with the character and getting to know that person, that I've never been sure that a subsequent book would have the same energy if I was coming back to that character, at least in the same time frame. I've written before about. I wrote as you pointed out, Phil, to start. I've written about Sandy Stern more than once, but I've come back to him at different times in his life. The same thing is true of Rusty Savage, who was the, quote unquote hero of Presumed Innocent. But, to pick up, with Pinky's next case or whatever it would be, it feels like it would be limiting in terms of, my ambitions as a novelist. That may be a complete illusion. And I think people who write series about the same character would probably quarrel with me about this. But it's why I've never done it.
I guess it's that thing where some people, from other people we've spoken to on this series as well, is that some people like the rigidity of that because it means that forces the brain then to be creative in other ways. If you've already set parameters that you then have to stick by, then again, you can kind of use that as a creative exercise. But hearing you chat there, I've kind of wondered why, and I've watched a lot of David E Kelley series over the years as well, why there are always so many different characters that come into these and into your books as well, and why it can't be that you could have a Pinky series, but you could have so many other different people that were actually the focus. You know, you're kind of doing the same thing, but you're kind of creatively satisfying yourself too.
Yeah, I can't answer for David, except that, we've had a long-running affinity for each other's work. The one thing David has said that so many narrative writers say is, he just listens to the characters speak. And certainly for me, I always think back about how I was criticized in the U.S. Attorney's Office by one of my supervisors and dear friends, Dan Reedy, who looked at me once and he said, "Why do you have to make everything so damn complicated?" You know, which is certainly not a virtue when you're trying to explain a case to a jury. But the answer is that's just the way I see the world. And, you know, if to me you'd be shrinking its dimensions if you didn't allow for the natural complications of life.
But at this point, I want to, just for you, Scott, I want to step in and say, whilst some aspects of the plot of Suspect, which we'll talk about in a bit, are complex, they are not complicated. This is not a difficult book to follow. You're not having to go back 2 pages when you're reading it. I flew through this in a week.
Yeah, no, this is, I mean, the timeline basically, you know, moves straight forward. So there's not a lot of flashbacks, which is one of the things that typically confuses readers. So I take it for granted, you know, Phil, you asked me before about what was liberating about writing from Pinky's point of view. And that was one of the things that she's, you know, she's free of the kind of complicated way that lawyers look at things. She's not supposed to be a highly lettered person. She's very bright, but you know, at the end of the last trial, her grandfather has come to accept the fact that he's never going to see her reading a book in her leisure time. So her vocabulary is simpler, and you know, that was both liberating and challenging in the sense that, you know, I really had to squash my own natural inclination, you know, my 7-syllable vocabulary, and you know, and put it in her terms, and that's, you know, that I certainly didn't think the writing was suffering for that.
So we should explain, and Scott's going to read us a bit in a second. So where we join this book is that she's an investigator for a defense lawyer who's looking after the chief of police. It's a female chief of police who's been accused of sexual harassment in order for other officers to get promoted. And that's probably about as much as you need to know, right, Scott? We don't need to do much more than that. And the other thing I should just mention is that alongside that main narrative, there's a subplot as where Pinky lives. A very buff dude moves in next door with odd nocturnal habits, and she's very curious about him. And
she nicknames him in her own head 2 TWO for the weird one. He makes no noise of any kind. He doesn't even bother picking up the mail. He's never seen in commerce with anybody in the building. And of course, it's just Pinky, and in part because, as you mentioned, he's good looking, that, you know, she wants to figure out what gives with this guy.
So where do we join the book in the passage you're about to read for us? Just set this up.
Well, actually, the passage that I'm about to read occurs with Pinky's first live encounter in the novel with the weird guy next door. But she's just explaining herself to readers. Becoming a private investigator never occurred to me when I was younger. Yet, here's the truth. I love to snoop and pry. I get a butt-tightening thrill out of it. Maybe some of that has to do with how often I miss signals in the rest of life. Investigating is like being the invisible man, not the one from the book I had to read in high school, but the old movie, somebody who can drift around and look in on people without ever really being seen. Oh, I think often, so that's this chick's deal. And when I'm being a PI, I can do stuff that's hard for me ordinarily. I don't have to grope for the words with strangers because I'm there to ask, what do you know about Joe Blow or Clown Brown? I don't care about the usual judgy thoughts people have about crazy Pinky because I've got a job to do. At night, I spend hours watching YouTube and visiting obscure sites, trying to master what I call the PI bot.
I love the way that you can just sort of visualize her so well, just even in that passage, I think. When you are starting to write a character like Pinky, does she arrive pretty much fully formed, or the version that you've just read, has that gone through? Have you already pretty much written the whole book and then gone back and readjusted the beginning so that it sounds more like we really know her now.
Once you concede that she is different by her own terms and most other people's, then you get into, things like the thrill she gets out of being able to spy on other people, because the truth is just what she says. She doesn't understand that much intuitively. So when she gets a chance to, watch without being seen, she's filling in what really are natural blanks for her.
Earlier, you were saying how some of Pinky was unfamiliar to you, like some of her lifestyle choices, some of the way she may speak, the syllable reduction. But there's a part in the book that relies on internal disciplinary hearings. Am I right in thinking that you were part of those hearings as a lawyer?
Yes, often and from many different angles. When I left the U.S. Attorney's Office, a career that included investigating a couple of police departments where excessive violence was under investigation, I was hired by the Village of Oak Park, which joins Chicago, to investigate their police department, and ended up recommending charges against 2 officers, and so prosecuted 2 police disciplinary cases. Then I ended up on the state police merit board, which hires and fires and disciplines state troopers in Illinois. And so I read many, many hearing transcripts in the cases of officers or troopers who were being suggested for discipline. And that was, our final decision after reading that transcript as to what kind of discipline would be imposed. So, I'm not one of those people who's, been a prosecutor or a defense lawyer who thinks that, he's a cop in disguise. That's not, I am under no such illusion. I know cops as lawyers know cops, but I do think I understand their lives and how police departments function, the odd dynamics within, because the police officers are very much our paid paranoids. They they're suspicious of everybody, and they take no one at face value and really trust very few people outside their inner circle. And that, of course, ends up being an attitude that infiltrates police departments where, the officers all have each other's backs on the street, but they don't really trust each other beyond, again, the people who've been their partners and the people who are their friends. And they're always, in my experience with them, imagining the worst about the guys on the other side of the locker room who they don't know very well, and thinking they've got some kind of scam running. So it's kind of amusing, and but it's part of what makes a police officer a good police officer, that they don't trust many people.
And with that vast experience you've had of dealing with and associating with police officers and experiencing the legal system in your country, do you feel America's any closer to seeing a police force that kills fewer of its own citizens?
I actually think we are. I don't know. I, for example, heard a reported piece yesterday on the local public radio station in Chicago, which says that the code of silence seems to be changing a little bit in Chicago, and that there are frequently episodes where officers will not suffer the shenanigans of their colleagues in silence, and will most often try to correct them on the scene. As, for example, one of the officers should have done with Shaven when he was murdering George Floyd, and just pulled him off and said, man, you're going to kill this guy. And so I think there's more of it. It's not all due to a a spirit of idealism. The reality for police officers in the U.S., just like everywhere else around the world, is everybody's got a camera, and if you're going to misbehave, you can't be completely sure that nobody's going to record that. So, some of it's an outside constraint, but I do think, especially among younger officers, there's less racism, less willingness, to engage in violence just to get people back in line.
Yeah.
So
I mean, we should say it's not as if racism isn't a huge issue in the UK as well.
Of course, yeah.
And with the police force as well. But I think there were a couple of things there that sort of struck me when you're talking, relating it to your fiction writing, is that firstly, I think there's that line between loyalty versus intimidation and bullying is a really interesting one to kind of explore in fiction, but also just that kind of notion of let's talk about that bit first, and then I'll talk about my second point.
Well, cops rightly see themselves as being on a battlefield.
Yeah.
And in a place like the United States, where the number of guns in private hands has grotesquely grown in the last 20 years, courtesy of the idiots on the U.S. Supreme Court, they view every citizen as a potential lethal threat. So they have got to be comradely out on the street, and they really do have to have each other's backs. And it's important in that environment that they trust one another. And that's part of what breeds the long-running code of silence, and the blue code, as it sometimes gets called. But I hope that police officers are beginning to be able to distinguish between what's necessary for their own survival and what literally obstructs justice. And we'll see. I don't expect any of these problems to get solved by tomorrow.
No.
And
when you're writing this as well, I mean, the other thing that I always find fascinating, and both Phil and I write not as prolifically, nearly, or successfully as you, I should add.
Yeah, neither of us have got a dagger, put it that way.
Yeah.
I kind of love that notion that you can sort of hear your legal brain throughout your prose, but also being well aware that in these heightened situations that you describe and you write about in Suspect and other books, people don't always act rationally, because you can't in that situation.
Yeah, I always thought that free market economics foundered on its base assumption that social actors behave rationally, because they must know different social actors than I do. And that's why I admire the people in, so-called behavioral economics who will look at the choices that people make and try to explain why they do things that are supposedly irrational, and what the overarching value system is that's somehow interfering. And the classic example in the United States is why so many people seem to vote against their financial self-interest. Free market economists can't explain that. People aren't supposed to do that. And yet, there are values that intervene that make, people view their vote as, to some extent, an idealistic statement.
I want to go back to something you said a little earlier about the pressure that you're under from David E Kelley, the kind of faux pressure to develop this, and my greed as a fan of yours, I want more of these books. So if you're unsure, what motivates you to start a new book? What are you looking for to keep you satisfied?
Well, in in the present case, the contract I signed 2 years ago, but
got it.
Well, there's not actually a deadline, and I have a wonderful editor, my editor Ben Severe, and he's not going to clobber me if I don't hand the book in on time. But look, I'm a lawyer. I'm a rule follower. What can I say? I regard it as part of my responsibility as a good citizen in the publishing relationship, to get this book done in reasonable time.
But if it's not another Pinky, what is it that I'm all creatively? I'm all meant. What are you looking for to juice you up so that you go, yeah, I'm writing that?
Well, I'm actually going back probably for the third and last time to Rusty Savage, who's at a much different time in his life. He's 75 in this novel, and at that age, taking on for the first time the one role he's never occupied in the legal system. He's been a prosecutor, he's been a judge, he's been a defendant, but he's never been a defense lawyer. And so now, because of family circumstances, he's going to be defending his first case.
Sounds cool. And can I ask as well, Scott, what you're like when you're not writing? So to relate it back to me, obviously, because that's the way my brain works. I don't notice this, but my husband says when I'm not writing, I'm quite restless, and I'm way more agitated than if I'm actually sort of focused on something and my creativity is being used in that way. Otherwise, I'm a bit of a nightmare.
Yeah. Well, I haven't asked Adrian about this, but I imagine that I'm easier to live with when I'm not in the middle of a novel, because I'm just apt to drift away literally in the middle of a sentence with the thought that that's something I want to capture for the book that I'm writing on. And it's some sideways thought that's come to me. So my wife, God love her, is forever going, finish your sentence. I don't know what you're talking about till you finish the sentence.
Yeah, so I think I get quite worked up about like society and the state of play right now and stuff, and it's like, channel it into your writing, like stop ranting.
Yeah. We all face that challenge in today's world.
Yeah, tell me about it.
Listen, you mentioned Rusty just before. So that will be the third fictional kind of revisit in novel form. But David E Kelley, who's dominating this podcast right now,
he'll be happy about that.
Shout out to David E Kelley. He's currently working on the Apple TV version of Presumed Innocent, right? So how's that? Because obviously we've all seen. So the Harrison Ford movie was my gateway to your books.
Right. For many people. So.
Yeah. And I mean, we're going back to an era where I had to go to the video shop and rent that movie, right? And come, because I wasn't old enough to get into the cinema to see it. And then having rented it, and it said, based on the novel by Scott Turow, I thought, who's this Scott Turow guy? Let me look this guy up and find some more books. And that was the gateway in. How are you feeling about reversioning it for TV for Apple?
Well, going back to our dominating motif, David told me that, this was the best venue because Apple apparently is going to be slower than the other platforms to adopt commercials. They're going to be commercials running on Netflix and Hulu or so I'm told. But so I feel good about Apple, and obviously that's a pretty deep pocket. And, I expect that to lead to an extremely well-known cast. Although for whatever reason, I'm still not at liberty to say who's going to be who, even though I have some insight into that. And I think what that's about is Apple is saving it for the maximum publicity impact.
But you've been involved, have you? You've had a seat at the casting table.
I wouldn't call it a seat. I would say that I'm allowed to look through the window.
Like knock on the glass sometimes. Be like, no.
No, I mean, if I knock, they ignore me. But somebody will occasionally, poke his or her head outside and say, well, this seems to be what we're doing. And I don't demand a a large role. And because, when it comes to film projects, I regard myself as essentially a 19th century child, which is to say, I speak when I'm spoken to. And, David Kelley, who said with all good intentions to me, we can do this together when he was talking about redoing Presumed Innocent. David is famous for taking on all the writing himself. And there is supposed to be a writer's room on this project, but every script so far has come straight from Kelley. And he will indulge the other people eventually, but I bet you what they shoot first, and I think they'll shoot 3 episodes first, starting in January. That'll probably be pure Kelley scripts. That's my guess. That's just a wild guess.
And so for things like that, I can appreciate how it's quite conflicting when something's being adapted into a different medium, but would you sort of have a conversation with him and provide like the overarching, this is where we start and this is where we're going to end, and then kind of not really do what you like sort of to get there, but this is how I see it happening? Or are you just like, it's fine, whatever?
Well, if you're talking specifically about Presumed Innocent, there is, you have to start out with the recognition that this is somewhat dated material, because, Presumed Innocent was written before the use of DNA evidence became common. And frankly, Rusty Savage, with that technology, would have been completely slabbed. He would have spent... He would have spent, any sequels would be about his life in prison. So there had to be changes. And, I didn't expect David to ask me for my permission. We have a very respectful relationship. Years ago, David asked me to work with him on one of his TV projects. So, but, and I told him, and I really meant it, that the end of the pilot episode, the first episode, shocked even me. And I thought that was one hell of an achievement. So, he doesn't need my guidance ordinarily. I know he's going to call me and probably about some legal situation and ask me what the alternatives are, and I'll be happy to answer. But I think his track record speaks for itself.
Yeah.
And his instincts as a narrative writer, and he's just awfully damn good. I don't think there's anybody who writes regularly for TV who's any better. I just don't think so.
Can I ask you a selfishly motivated question?
Please.
So we've had Lee Child on this pod. We've had Mike Connolly on this podcast, who've produced a prolific number of books.
Yeah.
You've produced 13, and because I'm greedy, I wish you'd have written more. What's been the barrier?
Well, there are a couple of barriers. For one thing, I retired from my law firm 2 years ago in August, and I have found that I write faster without the distraction of practicing law. I still have 2 pro bono cases that do occasionally take my time, but it's not like having a fuller menu of cases. The other thing is that my own process is slow. I don't outline to start. I grope, and I'll write little pieces of different scenes. I'll do character sketches one day, then I'll be thinking about somebody else, and I'll do a physical description. I'll describe the general area I'm writing about, and literally the geographical area. And I give up basically a year to that process, and it's not good or bad. It's the way I work. So it would be very hard for me to write 2 books a year, given that kind of a creative process. But, for me, I think when I get to the front to back draft, after doing a year of that, it's more coherent. And, by my own lights, richer that way.
And have you, I think I probably know the answer to this question already, but I assume you're somebody who enjoys working, because it's that kind of balanced question, right? So when you get to a certain level of success in your career, presumably financially, you wouldn't need to keep working, all the hours every single week. But are you somebody who is able to take a step back anyway and kind of spend more time with the family, or put limits on the time that you work? Or were you always kind of wanting to do writing, practice law, sort of do it all?
Well, I mean, look, there was a time in my life when, I was practicing law, but about 3/4 time and trying to write at the same time. And it didn't seem that I had a moment to breathe. And that slackened as the years went on. I think I'm pretty good at generally setting boundaries. Every now and then there's something I'm writing that's just coming so fast that I just don't want to get out of my chair. But generally speaking, I can say I'm going to be quitting. And usually for me, a writing day begins around 8 and ends usually by 1. And usually I can pry my behind out of the chair. Usually it's the obverse. It's hard to sit there that long. So when I was young, and honestly, probably nothing was more responsible for driving me to law school than the fact that I suffered from what I call the writer's disease, which is I could not turn my imagination off. And I knew I needed the distraction of something that I found incredibly compelling, and that turned out to be the law. So, and it in part was why I was so afraid after the success of my first nonfiction book to go back to writing full time, because I didn't want that ravening monster to grab me again. By now, I think I can set pretty good limits, notwithstanding the fact that my sentences drift off as I'm suddenly fascinated by some bright, shiny object passing behind my eyes.
Well, I did kind of want to mention before we kind of get to other books that you think we should be reading, but one of the things I really enjoyed in Suspect, and I don't know if this was just me, was that I almost felt like you could see in the way that you write, you can see that practical legal brain kind of showing all the process, showing how evidence is going to work, showing, putting forth an argument, and then you will kind of veer off and just give us a really interesting detour into a different character's life or something. And I kind of love that you could sort of follow that. It's almost like a roller coaster when you're reading.
Yeah, that's just me. That's just me being me. So,
well, it's great. I very much enjoyed it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
So when are we getting the next one? The one that you're working on right now? Is that about a year away?
I certainly will be done with a draft within a year. And then we'll just see where it slots in the time frame that Grand Central will prescribe. So, I know what my own goals are. I haven't shared them with my editor yet because then he'll hold me to it.
Don't worry, we won't tell them.
No.
I hope there's a pretty good draft by the end of June. So we'll see. We'll see how that goes. Yeah, thank you.
Give us some recommendations, and we ask every writer that comes on for some, can be fiction, non-fiction, but just something you've read recently that you've enjoyed that we should read.
I'll tell you a book that just took hold of me from the first page. And I think I'm objective about it. Adrian and I made friends on a book jaunt overseas with Bill Landay and his wife Sue, and Bill's the guy who wrote Defending Jacob. So he called me and said, do you mind reading my new book? And it's called All That Is Mine I Carry With Me. Right. But it, he knows that it's not a title that's going to fall trippingly off the tongue of readers. But it's a terrific book. It's a family book. It's a crime book. And, it's beautifully understated prose. And I don't know whether lay readers will end up objecting to some of the narrative poses or not. So we'll see. But I thought it was just a terrific book, really a great book. Maybe because it's, it begins with a paragraphs about writer's block. So, but which every writer will be able to relate to, even if she or he has never quite experienced that.
So this all that is mine I carry with me. It's William Landay, Landay.
Yeah,
and if you're listening in the UK, you've got a bit of a wait because according to what I'm looking at, it's not out till March next year. I don't know if it's already out in the US or not, but
it's not out. I read it in Galley. I don't know when it's coming here, but probably a few months before that. But to me, it was a great read, and I recommend that. I'm also rereading Endless Love by Scott Spencer, which was a book that just swept me off my feet when it was first published in 1979. And I am enjoying it once again, although some of what I'm enjoying is looking back at myself and seeing the parts of it that didn't matter to me then and matter to me now. But I think, this novel has been filmed at least twice that I'm aware of. And I don't think a great movie's been made yet, but it's a really wonderful novel. And I can recommend that unreservedly.
And do you ever go back and reread any of your early books now, or does That Way Madness lie?
Well, I have to reread them. For example, if I'm writing about Rusty Sabich again, I just need to refamiliarize myself with all of the data from the earlier books. But generally speaking, I read my own work with a feeling of satisfaction. I would not say that I've read any of my books cover to cover without finding something in them to regret. And that's why you write the next book.
Yeah, always.
And what do you do to solve writer's block? You mentioned it a moment ago.
I have not been badly afflicted by it in the last 20 years, but my solution is to reread and begin rewriting what I've previously written, usually what I wrote the day before. And that almost always primes the pump and gets me going. And if it's not the work of the day before, then it's some other piece of the book which will be nagging at me that I don't think was done even well enough for the first time through. And once you start rewriting, it's inevitable that you're writing and that you're figuring out what's going to come next.
Do you still love it, Scott?
Yeah, I really, as I always say to people, if you can arrange to become a best-selling novelist, I really recommend it to you. It's great. It's a great life, and truly, without being saccharine, the best part of it is the work. And I always look at Adrian and say, okay, I'm going upstairs now to play with my imaginary friends. And that kind of 6-year-old's wonder at being totally swept away by a world of my own imagining is far and away the best part of the deal. It really is. And, my inner 6-year-old never died. And, he gets his way once I set my fingers to the keyboard.
Well, if you, the adage we adhere to is if you can't get to be a best-selling novelist, get to interview them. And we've really loved having you on, Scott. So thanks so much for taking time for us.
Very kind. Thank you. I've enjoyed my time with each of you. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right. Adios.
You know what I really love about that chat at the end there with Scott, especially, was that he's unapologetic about it's a good life if you can make it work for you. I think, we're under no illusions that becoming a best-selling author is hit and miss. Like, there's no formula that's guaranteed for success. It's, like any other industry, really. Like, obviously there's a lot of hard work, but there's so much luck involved in it too. And so much, I think, with writing as well, if you've got the right people behind you and the support at the right time and all of that. But you know what? I'm happy for him that he's just really enjoying it and kind of doing what you hope people would do when they get to
and
that
also
level.
Reassuring that he said that he can write more quickly now, because the part where I was saying I'm greedy, I want more of your books. He's only done 13 books, and you compare him, say, similar age to Michael Connolly or Lee Child, and how many they've done. And he said, but I've got more prolific since I stopped working in law. And you think, oh yeah, you had a day job. And it is, that's your setup, isn't it? You've got several day jobs and you're still trying to write, and it just shows how much harder it is.
Yeah, and again, that's not unusual. I think so many really successful authors too still have day jobs because it doesn't pay well to be an author at all. Like, the figures involved are not, I think, what often people assume they will be. Obviously I haven't been paid anything yet for my writing, still unpublished, still writing, but that's been quite slow these last few months. But I am determined to keep going, because I think so much of writing as well is just not giving up.
100%. Yeah, 100%. And I think we maybe get sidetracked by a headline. You'll see a headline, won't you, so-and-so, but we've done it ourselves, haven't we? I remember the woman we interviewed whose first book went for 6 figures.
Laura Prescott.
It was there you go, you do remember. and it was a major part of our conversation, wasn't it? And then I wonder if maybe we're part of that. It's not misinformation because it's true, but I wonder if it creates this false premise that, you can get 6 figures for your debut, when actually I think the average advance is under 10 grand, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And that's £10,000 that you get in 3 installments. So when you sign, when the hardback proofs get published, and then when the paperback comes out. So you're looking at like 3 grand over sort of every 4 months for a year type thing. Right. So yeah, the figures are pretty small, but it doesn't make such a good news story, does it? But you're right. It should be. Of course, it's exciting when people get 6-figure advances, but more common is, yay, author gets like £500 for a book. Woohoo!
Put it this way, what we're trying to say to you is, if you're doing it for the money, you'd be better off trying to enter the Phil and Holly Wheel Pay Your Energy Bills competition on This Morning. That would probably pay more.
Yeah, and if you are doing it, again, it's not something that I have ever tried to do because I'm aware how depressing it would be. But if you worked out an hourly rate for how long it takes to write a book versus how much return you might get if you get published, it's not very much at all.
So what we're saying is, we're doing this for the love, you're reading it for the love, and the exceptional few get to make a few quid.
Correct. So you were saying at the start of this, you were going to say what else is on your to be read or TBR.
Oh yeah, so I just had a quick look. I've got a lot of memoir stuff going on, which is not like me, but there have been some books that have really interested me. So Jan Venner, who created and published Rolling Stone magazine in the States, his memoirs on my floor. I've started that and it's brilliant.
I think I'd like that.
And it starts off with dinner with John and Yoko. I mean, that's the starting point. It's like, you know what I mean? Tell me everything. Tell me all of that. So that's good. Do you know Kelly Ripa, who does did live with Regis and Kelly, and now it's live with
Ryan, right?
Ryan and Kelly, Ryan Seacrest, yeah.
Yeah.
And I've got her memoir, Live
Wire. Ooh, I would like that.
You would. So if you do want that book, you have to go to .com to get it.
Okay.
It's not out here, so I had to import it. It's fine. It's quite straightforward to do, and it's not overly expensive, but that's how you get that book. That's called Live Wire, Kelly Ripa. If you're listening, Kelly, you want to come on, you're very welcome. And what else have I got down there? Oh, yeah, the Alan Rickman Diaries.
Ah.
Which I read a serialization of in, I think, The Observer. I thought, yeah, that's really fun. He's a great dry writer, and almost quite sneery at some of the things he has to do, some of the frippery that goes around acting.
Yeah.
Which is really funny.
Likewise, I haven't read that either, but I remember seeing a few of the extracts and also hearing about it when it was being published. And all of the words written in the run up to that book coming out were like, Alan doesn't hold back. He's happy to name whoever it is, which I kind of like, because often, it's not that you want somebody to slag somebody off for no good reason, but also it can be frustrating when it's kind of veiled, where they're like, oh, this one person I worked with one time. You're like, well, just tell us who it is, and kind of, yeah.
Slightly easier to do when perhaps you're no longer with us.
Perhaps indeed. And I hope he's okay with his diaries being published. I'm sure he is. I have got, in that vein as well, Paul Newman's memoir that's sitting on my to be read pile too, which also sounds fascinating because I think it was something that he was working on for quite a long time. And he is very candid in that. And supposedly it presents a picture that you may not be expecting of the legend, the acting legend that is Paul Newman, and obviously his great sources too.
Very good. Well, maybe we'll have made some reading progress the next time we speak to you. And if not, there's always Christmas.
There is. But before then, if you've enjoyed this podcast, then do subscribe if you haven't done that already. Do rate and review it on whatever platform you're listening to, because it just helps with other people discovering it, which would be great. Because, just to reiterate, we do this because we love reading and we love sharing what we learn when we speak to authors. And we always find it really interesting. So I hope that you all do. So thank you, by the way, just for listening.